I think that's all the technical details. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. We're so pleased to have Dr. Fiona Miller joining us for the webinar. Dr. Miller is a licensed clinical psychologist and director of the University of Michigan's Autism Consultation and Treatment Services Program in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She received her PhD from the University of Toronto and completed her internship at the Child Psychiatry Program at the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, also in Toronto. In addition to her work as a clinician and director, Dr. Miller is an international trainer on the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised and the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, which you all may recognize are two of the gold standard instruments for diagnosis of ASD. Dr. Miller was also a clinical consultant on the Simon Simplex Selection and the Silence Variation in Individuals project, in which some of you in the audience may have participated. She has specific expertise in the diagnosis and treatment of ASD, as well as evidence-based treatments for parent-child difficulties and aggression. She's here today to speak with us about the impact of ASD on families. And Dr. Miller, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you. We're so happy to have you joining us today.
Thanks, Casey, and thank you for the invite. I'm delighted to speak to this group. And so today I'm going to discuss, as Casey mentioned, an area of research that's really quite important to me, focusing on the experiences of parents who are raising children with ASD. There's been an explosion of research in this area in the past few years, but there's still much to learn. And so what I'm going to focus on today is things that we already know about parents' experiences, models for coping with some of those experiences, and questions about what we need to know more about. And so one of the things that we know as clinicians and families living with children who have ASD is that the symptoms in ASD defy generalization. So we can have children whose cognitive skills or whose measured intelligence can range from very severely impaired to quite gifted, and children whose social interactions may appear aloof or passive, or very socially motivated children, but the quality of their social overtures and responses is a bit atypical. In terms of communication, children can be nonverbal or verbal, and they may have very intense or mild restricted and repetitive behaviors. And so I kept this slide in the presentation because I think it highlights the fact that ASD symptoms defy generalization, and parenting children with ASD can too. Strategies that work in one context or at one particular point in time don't always work in other contexts or across kids. Sorry, I'm just moving slides along. There we go. And I think this slide on parenting challenges, looking at core symptoms and co-occurring symptoms, highlights the challenges that parents are dealing with on a day-to-day basis as they go about parenting. And so in addition to the core symptoms of social communication problems and restricted and repetitive behaviors, children with ASD are often presenting with language disorders, expressive and receptive language disorders, intellectual disability, sleep disturbance, and then we have a range of comorbid diagnoses. Some of them are showing aggression, some have ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorders, anxiety, and depression. And in addition to that, families are also coping with, at particular points in time, with experiences of grief and loss around the original diagnosis, or as their child fails to meet a particular developmental milestone, that experience can be reenacted. We know there's higher rates of marital conflict, and then the demands of sort of associating with or interfacing with treatment services, acquiring treatment services, and engaging with them in the school and the community. Many parents spend a fair bit of time taking their kids from one activity to another or from one intervention to another. Moreover, we know that symptom expression within ASD varies according to age, developmental level, and context. So parenting strategies, as I mentioned, that work at one point in time and in one context don't always translate into effective strategies at other points in time. And so this increases the overall demand that parents experience on a daily basis. So in terms of what we already know, we know that in terms of parent experiences, the stressors begin early. Parents of children with ASD experience complicated pregnancy and birth histories, and they also report concerns about their child's development within the first 6 months. There may not be a clear diagnosis until later on, but parents are concerned that something's not quite right. within the first year. And then as they move to as children age, around 18 to 24 months, parents are reporting very specific symptoms associated with ASD. But most first-time diagnoses occur around 36 months, and there's still a fair bit of regional variation in that age of first-time diagnosis. And it can be as late as 6 years in some states. And for parents whose children have complicated diagnostic profiles, the journey to receiving an accurate diagnosis may be a fairly long one. And I think this can be especially true for parents of verbal children whose children have suffered a trauma or loss in addition to symptoms of ASD, because their symptoms are attributed to the trauma or loss rather than ASD itself. And so just getting to a point of a diagnosis can be fairly complicated. We know that parents of children with ASD report increased parenting stress, and it's fairly clearly documented that they report more parenting stress than parents of typically developing children, of children with non-ASD developmental disorders, of children with behavior problems and health concerns. And we found that this effect has been found in both nationally representative and clinic-based samples. And given that ASD is a developmental disorder, we find that parenting stress may peak at different developmental transition points. So there's the issues around first concerns when they first become aware that something's not quite right about their child's development. There's the experience of receiving a diagnosis for their child, and then transition points such as entry into kindergarten, moving to the 3rd and 4th grades when peer groups become a fair bit more selective, and then transitions to middle school, adolescence, high school, adulthood, and then beyond. So the stress tends to peak at different developmental transition points, but it doesn't always go away, and there can be new challenges at each of these points, which makes parenting fairly demanding. We also know that parental wellness, including adjustment to the diagnosis, is predictive of child treatment outcomes, which I think also highlights the need to spend more time in this area clinically, as well as looking at the research. And this relationship is especially strong for infants and preschoolers, where parents can often take or be asked to take on an active role as a therapist or a co-therapist. And then within ASD, the specific sources of parenting stress are not clearly understood, or at least consistent across studies. There's some evidence that it's related to treatment-seeking behaviors, which may be a proxy variable for symptom severity, so that parents who have children who are more severely affected are seeking out more services. And then there's some other evidence that child characteristics such as language level or child age or co-occurring symptoms such as behavior problems or anxiety are sources of stress, perhaps even more so than core symptoms. We also know that more information is known about maternal experiences. Fathers' reports are significantly underrepresented in the research literature. And we understand that the impact of rearing a child with ASD extends well beyond the parenting system to other aspects of parents' lives and the family system. And so I'm going to talk a bit about the current study, which is a study I did with Lawrence Kowalski and Caitlin Sorensen at the University of Michigan Autism and Communication Disorder Center. And really what we were trying to do was improve our models of clinical care, and wanted to obtain information on the nature and sources of parent distress by characterizing the experiences of mothers and fathers raising children with ASD. And then our secondary goal was to examine potential relationships between parent stress, parent-reported stress, and child characteristics. And so we used a clinic databank sample, which included 286 consecutive ASD evaluation cases. And so these were families who had been referred for an ASD diagnostic evaluation and had participated in a 6 to 13-hour face-to-face evaluation with a clinician. And then each child was given a best estimate diagnosis following that evaluation. And in the end, our sample included 254 children who had been diagnosed with ASD and 32 children who had been diagnosed with non-spectrum issues. And from that group, we had 453 parental reports on 254 children with ASD, including 243 moms, 210 dads, and 199 mother-father-child trios in there. So this sort of indicates that the majority of our sample had two parents available and engaged in parenting, and about 3/4 of the sample was married at the time that data was collected. So in thinking about the group of 453 adults that the group of children that they're reporting on, about 67% were given a best estimate diagnosis of autism, and 33% were given an autism spectrum diagnosis, keeping in mind that this data was collected before the release of DSM-5 and the move to an overall autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. The children themselves ranged in age from 20 months to 18 years 9 months, and the mean age was 6.5 years. And 75% of the sample were boys, 25% were girls. In terms of their expressive language development, to kind of give people an idea of who's being parented in the sample, a full half of the sample were administered an ADOS Module 1, indicating that the kids were using mostly single words to communicate. Another quarter were given an ADOS Module 2, indicating the children were using simple phrases to communicate. And then the final quarter were verbally fluent speakers. There's a fairly broad range of verbal IQ assessed, with the average being 63 and a ratio IQ of 2 to 151. And then for nonverbal IQ, the children's IQ ranged from 20 to 155, with 75 being the average. And so their adaptive behavior scores for the sample was a 59, which is considered in the low range. And the ADOS calibrated severity score was a 7, indicating that overall the sample was quite affected by ASD. And so what we did is we looked at parent responses to this one single question, which was, what effects has this child had on other areas of your life, including marriage, family relations, social relations, work situation, and so forth. And then what we did is we developed a qualitative coding scheme to analyze parent responses to this. And we literally cut up de-identified text and sorted them into themes, and then used those codes and themes for the rest of the database. There were actually 218 very, very specific codes, and they were then sorted into 25 themes. What we found was that mothers wrote longer reports than fathers, significantly more. And so mothers are reporting higher levels of stress, and it could be that they're reporting and experiencing higher levels of stress, but I think we need to look at that a bit more in further research. And then we also, after each clinician coded the response, they gave it a global parent stress rating. And it was a stress rating on a 4-point scale designed to reflect the amount of stress that was getting reflected in the parent report. And so almost half of the sample were reporting moderate to severe levels of stress. Mothers were reporting higher levels of severe stress, and fathers were reporting higher levels of moderate stress. And as I mentioned, the 218 codes were grouped into 25 themes using easy text software developed by the CDC, and the percentage of exact agreement across the 3 coders was 93%. And then every 10th report was triple coded by each of the raters to prevent rater drift. And then the codes were grouped into themes, 25 themes. 6 of them had a positive valence or a positive report about the impact of this child on their life, and 19 had a negative or a stress-related response. And keeping in mind that these were, these questions were asked of parents who were coming for a diagnostic evaluation or reevaluation, and so these were people who were seeking help. If we had looked at the general population, we may have had a higher number of positive themes, or if we'd asked specifically about positive themes, we might have had a higher response rate. So in terms of parenting effects, 40% of mothers and 25% of fathers spontaneously reported that they were having challenges managing their children's behavior. And exhaustion was also a significant issue, with 40% of moms and 18% of dads reporting that they were exhausted by parenting demands, most often on a daily basis. 31% of moms and 16% of fathers reported feelings of loss regarding the hopes and expectations that they'd had for their child. And 26% of moms and 15% of dads reported feelings of anxiety around parenting. And then I think the last one that was surprising to me was that 70% of moms and 9% of dads reported that their parenting skills had been criticized by others. And so this was, it was not asked about, but they were saying that specifically, but what parents reported was that other people had criticized their parenting skills. And then overall, moms showed higher levels of stress than dads, or reported higher levels of stress than fathers. And then in terms of marital effects, the most commonly reported marital effect was that 25% of moms and 18% of dads reported that they were experiencing marital stress because they had parenting differences on how to perceive their child's symptoms or manage their children's behavior. So this was independent of the marriage itself. What they were saying was that their lack of agreement on how to manage child behavior or how to view child behavior was the source of parenting stress. Another portion also said that they had experienced increased marital strain due to having a child with autism. And here, perhaps not surprisingly, moms and dads were reporting not significantly different levels. Given that we have about 75% of the sample already being married, these are probably the same relationships that are getting reported on. And then a very small portion of fathers, around 11%, noted that the effect of having a child with autism was that their wife or partner was showing increased stress. And then in terms of family effects, 28% of moms and 16% of dads reported negative effects on siblings of the child affected by ASD. And most of the concerns centered around the well-being of the non-affected siblings who received less parenting attention, had increased expectations for managing their own self-care, and also were exposed to a higher level of sibling conflict. And so parents were pretty concerned about their other children. And then looking over at the next column, almost 20% of moms and 10% of dads reported that other family members denied their child had had any difficulties, and that the denial of the child's symptoms was a source of stress. I think we hear a little bit about this in clinic when parents are telling us that nobody believes my child has ASD, or they think it's a parenting issue, or they think it's something else and he's just going to grow out of it. But it's showing up, at least in this data, that others' denial of their child's problems is a source of stress. 16% of moms and about 8% of fathers reported a lack of social support from family members. And 16% of moms and 11% of fathers also reported that their family life was restricted and that they couldn't do as many things as they might like to do, such as go to the mall, attend a basic family function, relax. Most often because it created a bit of stress for the child with ASD, and avoiding it was a much better plan than trying to expose the whole family to the situation. In terms of employment effects, moms were reporting significantly more employment effects than dads. 25% of moms reported that they had restructured their jobs to accommodate family needs, and 7% of fathers did. And then 22% of moms reported that they had lowered or limited their career aspirations in order to care for their affected child. And so I think this is important considering the sorts of losses that parents have. There's losses around the initial losses around expectations for their child's development that happens pretty frequently, but there's also personal losses, like loss of participation in a career path that one had valued prior to having children. And then a very small percentage of parents reported that they had received support from their employer, such as flexible work hours. And so we then looked at parent stress by children's characteristics, and keeping in mind that we've got one rating here and then frequency count data derived from an open-ended response on a questionnaire. And so it's perhaps not the very best type of data to look at associations between parent reports and child stress, because parents could report on anything. It might have been better to have a closed-ended questionnaire and then look at specific relationships to child characteristics. But I think what we found gives us some preliminary data. And essentially what we found was that moms of school-age children were reporting slightly higher levels of stress than moms of preschool children. And that with dads, their reports of stress did not appear to vary by child age. We did find one trend in the data, and that parents of children who were showing higher levels or intensity of restricted and repetitive behaviors were experiencing more stress. And that's perhaps not surprising when you think of how much more difficult it can be to manage a child who's having pretty intense reactions to changes, transitions, or has a really high need for insistence on sameness. And so to summarize, I think overall what this particular study showed was that mothers of children with ASD are reporting significant stressors related to behavior management, exhaustion, loss, sibling effects, anxiety, restructuring their employment, and then marital conflict due to parenting differences, and negative career effects. And then fathers are reporting overall less information overall and perhaps lower levels of stress. And so in thinking about this information, one of the things we spend a lot of time about in our clinic at least is thinking about models for coping for families. There's obviously the demands of coping with child needs and finding intervention that's appropriate and trying to get children hooked up into the best types of services. But there's also models of family coping. And given the range of challenges and the diversity of behavior within ASD, I think what we need to think about as a field is individualized and flexible plans that are appropriate for coping. Because there's such a broad phenotype that's getting diagnosed and parents are coping with that or managing that, we really need to have individualized models for families. And so one of the things that we talk about, or encouraging families to do in our clinic at least, is to invoke a problem-solving approach and to really spend, to sort of make it a priority and actively devote 3 hours at least every few months to assessing the experiences in their family, identifying strengths and areas for growth, rank ordering their concerns, and brainstorming solutions, and then implementing and evaluating the outcome. And I think what's more important about this slide, rather than any of the specifics, is that families really get a chance to sit down and evaluate this every 3 months. They can spend so much time engaging in treatment services and finding more services that it can really be difficult for them to prioritize an assessment of their family system and then examine parental self-care. And so it's important to consider the different systems involved in a parent's life and to set goals across those systems. So we've got the child system, the parent system, the family and partner relationships, as well as community. And these are systems that we all interact with on a daily basis. And ideally what we want to do is help parents reflect on and examine their experiences at each of these levels and consider what's working and what's not working. It's also pretty important to limit the number of goals that one sets across a 3 to 6 month period to about 4 or 5 goals. If we start setting a goal, 4 to 5 goals for each of these systems, whether it be like helping a child develop expressive language or develop an adaptive behavior skill or practice self-care or invest time in a spousal relationship or explore relationships with the school, it can be pretty hard to manage those across all of those systems for any length of time. And so I think the goal is to try and set 3 or 4 or maybe even 4 or 5 targets across these systems and to try and focus on them for 3 to 6 months. And the model that we're proposing anyways is that for each system, parents can identify strengths, and to consider what's going well, and especially to document what's going well. It can be so easy for families to reach a milestone and then set the next milestone and not take the time to write down what they've already achieved and to reflect on that. And the forcing oneself to write down the goals that have been achieved and the strengths and gains that have been made for each of them can be a really helpful process. And then to identify growth opportunities. What's causing daily stress? Where would you like things to be in 3 to 6 months? What might a manageable goal be in 3 to 6 months? And then setting priorities. What am I most worried about? What am I worried about on a daily basis? And what changes might be manageable or feasible? And so these are sort of short-term goals that can be considered every 3 months or so, 3 to 4 months, and consider daily stressors, desired changes, and weekly adjustments. I think too often what we see is that the allocation of time and resources within most family systems of parents parenting children with ASD is like this inverted triangle here, where the needs of the affected child are dominating the family system, and then parents are trying very hard to manage everything else, and then at the very bottom is parental self-care. And so it can be important to check the allocation of time and resources within the family system, at least check it periodically and see what the balance looks like. And if it's out of whack or out of balance, it's important to try and make some efforts to rebalance it. And to that end, we encourage parents to take a moment or take a few hours every few months and sort of reflect on their role. First of all, their role as an adult before they became a parent, and then their role as a parent, and then their own parenting history. And sort of information from this can be useful in setting goals and practicing self-care, and in sort of managing the kind of incredible demands that most of them are facing most days. And so in the adult role, things like identifying what one's good at, what they enjoy, what nourishes them, can be really helpful. Also reflecting on whether one's satisfied with their employment status or their work-life balance. And then in the parenting role, finding out what parents value about the role. What are the daily stressors, the longer-term stressors, what they might like to change, and whether they feel efficacious about one aspect of their parenting skill set or multiple aspects. And then whether or not they need support or respite. And then finally, I think another thing to reflect on is parenting history in terms of how one was parented themselves. And this can be important because we tend to learn our parenting styles as a heuristic based on how we were parented. And that may or may not easily translate into parenting a child with ASD. It can be very hard, for example, if a parent's been asked to implement a pretty rigid behavior system and they grew up in a family that was a pretty flexible system where parents followed the child's lead on many things or vice versa. So the goal is to consider how one's parenting history and then to consider how it might interface with raising a child with ASD. And sort of making some of these thought processes conscious can actually be helpful when parenting their own child. And I think self-care is critical. I think probably the most important thing I could say today is for parents to be alert to feelings of distress. We know that there's experiences of loss, despair, and hopelessness, depression, anxiety, and exhaustion. And it's important to seek professional help immediately if a parent's experiencing this. Self-care can be hard because parents are coping with many other demands, but it can also be hard because if a person's in a stressful situation for a long period of time, the line between regular stress and then clinically significant distress can become blurred. So it can be difficult to recognize when professional help is necessary. And then moving on to the family system, again, it can be helpful to assess where the family system's at every 3 or 4 months, and examine the spousal relationship, increased connection or alignment with your partner, or whether or not parents are on the same page, or how their agreement or disagreement is affecting their family relationships. It can also be important to examine the impact on the family system. If a family, for instance, is finding that they can't spend any time together or can't leave the house together or it's just too stressful, then that might be a good target for intervention, and to find some low demand activities that the family can engage in that are really a bit easier to handle, like going for an ice cream or that sort of thing. Or finding something but spending time or energy looking at that. And then consider sibling effects. And then again, documenting the joys. So these are just models of coping, possible coping models for the family level. In terms of setting goals, it's a good idea for goals to be concrete and specific and manageable. And then these are just some sample goals, like monitoring your stress level, monitoring someone's stress level, practicing self-care, spending time in low-demand activities like going to a pizza restaurant. Or if that's a high-demand activity, which I could imagine it might be, finding one that's low demand, watching a particular TV show together or playing a video game together. In addition to sort of these shorter term goals, it's important to consider, or it may be important or helpful to consider future issues annually. And I bring this up because we often hear from parents, and certainly read in the reports that we coded, that against the backdrop of the daily parenting demands is this stressor about what is going to happen in the future, and what are my child's long-term options for independence, or after I'm not here, who's going to take care of my child. And against that backdrop of future concerns, it can be hard to parent on a daily basis and cope with the sort of day-to-day concerns when the future concerns are quite significant. And so thinking about annually setting aside time to consider future issues and see where the system is going can be a useful exercise, and it can de-emphasize the background stress on day-to-day experiences. So one of the things we encourage families to do is to sort of set a time annually to deal with long-term issues like perhaps a trust fund, or exploring options for life after high school, that sort of thing. With the goal being is that they're really going to try and compartmentalize the future concerns to that particular point in time, and free themselves up to deal with daily concerns on a day-to-day basis. Free themselves up a bit. And then finally, I just wanted to end with a quote from Barbara Firestone's book, Autism Heroes, Portraits of Families Meeting the Challenge. And I wanted to take this quote from the foreword because the book celebrates families, but I think Kathy's point, Kathy wrote the foreword, Kathy Lord wrote the foreword, and it's a pretty salient point. And essentially what she's talking about is the need, parents and professionals are highly engaged in trying to find the right resources for children and trying to make those connections happen and find out what's best for each child. But it's important to also for parents to give themselves permission to enjoy life, to seek out opportunities. And what she talks about in this quote is for parents to allow their children to see themselves enjoying life. And she says, at some point we're all humbled by how little we know about the development of this complex disorder or disorders that are called ASDs and what is best for each child. Ultimately, families have jobs on multiple levels, from advocate and chauffeur to cheerleader and tutor. I was struck by another statement in this book, that families need to let their children see themselves enjoying life, because life is more than IEPs, therapy sessions, passing tests, and reaching milestones. This seems like an extremely important point to consider, not just for the immediate family of a child with ASD, but also for extended families trying to support their children and brothers and sisters who are parents of children with autism. And so again, I think it highlights the need for parents to give themselves permission to enjoy life and to seek and accept supports from families and friends and professionals within the autism community. And I think one of the really nice things about Ian is that it allows professionals and parents to connect in a way around some of these issues. And then if we look at the next slide, there's some resources for parents. There's our clinic, but there's also the Autism Speaks toolkits, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. And then adult resources on the slide after that. So I think just want to say thank you. And Casey, if you have got any questions, I'll take them.
Thanks so much, Fiona. I'm seeing a lot of just general comments from families that that they, or what you're saying is resounding with them, and they're really appreciative of the talk. So certainly thank you for taking the time. And I just want to remind everybody that we are going to post these slides, so don't feel the need to pull out your pen and paper and write down every one of these links. We will post these slides on the website, and so you'll be able to look at this at your leisure at a later time. And so Fiona, I do have a few questions for you, and they're actually continuing to come in, so I'm just going to go ahead and start from the top. Somebody's wondering if you have identified the key support systems that parents are reporting as essential to surviving the challenge of parenting a child with ASD.
Yeah, and I think it's mixed. So in our data, 27% of moms and 14% of dads identified family and friends as sources of support. However, an additional 15 to 20% of parents reported lack of supports from family and friends. And I mentioned the experience of other people denying that their child had problems or criticizing their parenting skills or attributing their child's problems to their parenting skills. And so one of the things I think that might be helpful is for parents to consider the types of support that they're hoping to receive from different systems in their lives, and sort of maybe spend some time actively thinking about which levels of support and what type of support a particular system is capable of or perhaps not capable of providing. In my own clinical experience, I think this has been most critical when thinking about close familial relationships where expectations of support are pretty common. But then families realize that family members are perhaps not able to provide the support they're hoping for. And so it can be helpful, for example, to realize that grandparents may not know one's experience or be able to provide child care, but might be able to provide meal or transportation or be present without offering advice. And so it may take some time to discover which support systems are going to work, and they will vary by different families. But the process of sort of going through that and thinking about it actively and thinking about which supports are lacking and which what the current systems can help out with can be useful.
Great, thanks. So the next question, have you been able to extrapolate your research to the added impact of having more than one child affected with ASD?
And so we did not look at that in our sample because we only had a small percentage of parents reporting on multiple children. And the reports were single, so they weren't linked. They weren't even linked. So we don't have data from our study on that. I think it's a really good question for future research, and I think I would just imagine that having multiple children with special needs likely increases all of the parenting demands I just described. And there may be some protective mechanisms that operate and that parents have pretty obvious needs for support within the community, but I would imagine it increases parenting stress on a daily basis.
All right, great. I have a series of questions here that I'm seeing pop up more frequently. So there's various differences between types. So I'll start with one of them. So have you been able to identify any differences in the impact between single parent and two parent families?
And so in our data, we found that we only had a small percentage of single. I think it was 17% of mother-only reports and 4% of father-only reports. So it was pretty small in our data, and I wouldn't want to generalize from those findings. I think what we do know is that marital strain can be a daily problem when parents aren't agreeing on the child's symptoms and how to parent them, and so that being together, it can be a source of strain, and then being apart, there may or may not be a parent will have fewer resources in the sense that another partner is not available to help out with things and provide daily support. On the other hand, living in a family system where there is marital conflict around parenting on a daily basis can also be a pretty significant stressor. So I think at this point we don't have enough information to sort of say specifically what it's like, but there can be small advantages, I think, to both, to being a single parent and to being a parent in a relationship. Ideally, what I would recommend to parent is to find somebody who can understand some sort of their experiences and help instrumentally with them, whether it's with daily parenting tasks or getting their child through the day or transportation or something, but somebody who can provide some respite because the need for respite came up over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. So related to that, is there any data on how many parents of autistic children are single versus married or in a stable relationship?
And so that's a bit more mixed. There was a study, I think by Hartley a few years ago, that found that the divorce rate was 2 times higher when he compared a family, or when they compared a family of children rearing, family of parents raising children with ASD relative to families raising children without developmental disabilities. And so the divorce rate in the families with ASD was about 24%. And it was about 14% in the other families in the comparison group. I think one of the things that's interesting is that in the families where they were parenting a child with ASD, the risk of divorce remained high throughout the child's middle years, adolescence, and adulthood, whereas it diminished in the other group. And so the risk of divorce appears to be higher for a longer period of time. Which is perhaps not surprising because the demands of parenting stay high. They don't peter off a bit as they might in other families. And there's a chance that the child will also be staying within the home too, which could be a source of stress. On the other hand, Friedman and colleagues did a study that was a population-based study in 2011 looking at data from the National Survey of Children's Health. And they found in this study anyways that there was no elevated risk for divorce in families caring for a child with ASD. So it looks like right now the data are mixed. One study showing, or a few studies showing an elevated divorce rate, and others showing no risk at all.
Okay, thanks.
So I think we need more information on that.
Definitely. So going back to some of the individual differences issues, did you see any differences in data on impact to parents and male versus female children on the spectrum?
You know, we have not looked at that in our sample. I think that's a good question, and we'll look at that actually. I think parental stress is more likely to vary perhaps as a function of symptom severity in the core domains, as well as the comorbid symptoms like anxiety, aggression, obsessive compulsive behavior that parents are coping with. As I mentioned during the talk, we did look at the intensity of restricted and repetitive behaviors and found a trend that, that increased restricted and repetitive behaviors were associated with more parental stress, but we haven't looked at gender specifically.
Okay. I want to jump to one of the questions that's coming up a lot in the chat. So a lot of people are wondering about sibling issues. So if you have any additional information regarding siblings of children with special needs, any specific types of programs or supports that may be helpful for siblings, in particular school age, just seems to be coming up a lot, but really any, I imagine, folks would be interested in.
I have not looked at the sibling literature. I think in terms of recently, I think in terms of clinically, the types of information or the types of things I would be asking parents in our clinic to engage in is to consider a few things. One would be to consider taking the child the sibling to therapy and sort of giving that child a chance to explore issues or concerns. Another is sibling groups, but sometimes they can be hard to find and they can depend on the match between the sibling and other siblings. But taking a child to therapy, giving them the space to explore some of the issues and concerns, and then also to consider either a sibling therapy or a behavior management strategy that involves both of the children. We found in our data anyways that children were exposed to increased conflict with their affected sib, most likely due to lack of understanding. There was an increased risk of sibling conflict. And so, setting ground rules for how to have arguments and how to disagree can be a helpful process for families to go through. That can also be hard to set up without some additional support from a therapist. And so I would recommend exploring that option. And then the other thing I might recommend doing is, which I'm sure most parents have thought about anyways, is spending time with the sibling in low-demand activities. So taking the non-affected sibling for ice cream. So it doesn't have to be, and to sort of integrate those events into one's daily or weekly activities. Too often the needs of the whole family can get prioritized, but it can be helpful just to spend time watching TV or reading a book, or doing something that's pretty low demand, and they're just physically being together with the child who's not affected.
Perfect. We're running out of time. I'll just do one final question. I appreciate everybody's questions. We have so many I can't even keep up, but I'm going to try and get to one that's also coming up frequently and also came up in email actually prior to the webinar. And this is sort of about issues related to parents who work. They're wondering if there are differences in the impact based on household income, whether folks are working outside or inside the home, and then related to that, if there's any way for parents who are working to reduce stress due to all the demands from outside employment in addition to the child with ASD.
Okay, so I think that's a really good question. I think we need more research on it to come up with a full answer. At this point in time, I think we know that parents are reducing their career aspirations, which can be a source of stress, or they've readjusted their employment goals, which can also be a source of lower income and stress. And so we know from the general developmental literature that it's the match between a parent's desired employment situation and their actual employment situation that's pretty significant as a predictor of wellness, which can have impacts on the family system. And so if a parent wants to work, is nourished by work, and is not working, then that's likely going to have significant impacts on the family system. And it's important to sort of recognize that. We also know that it can change as children's needs change. Parents can take some time off if they would like during the earlier years as they get things organized, and then may seek to go back to work, although it might not be in the same way or at the same level. But it's pretty important to be, I tell families, at least in our clinic, it's pretty important to be realistic about what you actually do want to do, and to have that as a conscious problem-solving process. And to try and be honest with oneself, and then at least one knows what one would like to do, and then sort of work from there. After that, I think in terms of coping with work and coping with a child who's got special needs, it's to the extent that a parent can outsource things is probably the most important thing one can do. So if financial resources are available, purchasing in additional supports like cleaning, any kind of additional support can be helpful. And considering where one can do that. And also at times limiting the number of things they're going to do outside of the family. So if they have children who are engaged in a few activities a week, reducing that, but trying to reduce overall external stressors that are maybe perhaps more optional in the family system. But I think the work situation is quite complicated, and it depends on financial need, as well as career aspirations and whatnot. So it probably requires a significant time to sort of sit down and think through it. But to not necessarily forget that work can be a source of nourishment for some parents.
All right. Well, we really appreciate your time, Dr. Miller. We had so many questions. I wasn't able to get to them all, and we are actually a few minutes over. But I still appreciate your time, and I appreciate everyone who joined. Please look for the webinar to be posted in a week or two. We'll send out that link. And we will also send out advertisements for the next webinar once we schedule it. Thank you again, Dr. Miller, for your time today.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.